This is ACOFAE. Laura Marie and Jessica Marie proudly present A Court of Fandoms and Exploration, a podcast. Fair warning, everything the hosts say is explicit, full of spoilers and adult content and shall not be used against them. They have opinions. Let's try not to drag anyone for expressing themselves and just have fun for an hour. We all deserve it.
This episode contains spoilers from A Far Better Thing by H.G. Parry, A Tale of Two Cities, and The Infernal Devices, with mentions of Cinderella is Dead, Shadowhunters, and Romeo and Juliet. For full list, please see show notes.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to A Court of Fandoms and Exploration, your weekly deep dive into the fantasy, literature, and fandoms that we love. I'm Laura Marie.
And I'm Jessica Marie.
And today we are discussing A Far Better Thing by H.G. Parry,
which we received as an ARC. Thank you so much, Tor. And it was pitched to us, honestly. It was pitched to us as a Tale of Two Cities retelling with fantasy elements. And it was very interesting. And we wanted to kind of maybe use this as a vehicle to drive the conversation about retellings in media, retellings in books, retellings and just like kind of our exposure to the stories and maybe some that we didn't even have a familiarity knowing where they came from. I mean, Laura, what was your experience with A Tale of Two Cities? Was it like a required reading for you? Was it one of those things where you just kind of picked up and you were like, you know what? I want to read the classics.
No to all of those things. All right, we're gonna get a 1-star review. I don't like the classics for the most part. I appreciate them. I understand why they are important. I understand that they show us a glimpse of the time. I understand all of this. I have a hard time reading most of the classics, not for any particular reason for Dickens. It's just, I don't know. So yes, I read this in high school. I read it again in college because I had to know how to teach it. It's just one of those things. And it never, okay. You know me. You know me. I started off in historical fiction, so you would think, but then I went to fantasy, and here's the thing. I look for fantasy when it's not there. So even as a kid, I was like, but again, I think there's another conversation to be had about like required reading, because I'm very torn on required reading. And so like, yes, I had to read this. This is required reading. And I'm sure that tainted a lot of it. And then when I read it again as an adult, I was again reading it for school, just in a completely different context. So I, again, didn't love it. But the fact that it was required reading when I was younger and then again when I was older was very interesting. And I'm kind of torn on required reading, Justin. I would like to know your opinion on this. And we have not discussed this earlier, so this is like fresh. I would like to know what you think about required reading in general, because this is what I think. I think that on one hand, required reading in school is wonderful because it exposes children to works of literature that for the most part, they would not have picked up on their own for whatever reason, being a child, right? Like, sometimes you just don't want to. So that's wonderful. And you're forced to read it. You're forced to digest it. Everybody had to go through Romeo and Juliet. You popcorn read that shit in school. Like everybody had to read it. Everybody had to watch it. So that's great, that exposure. But on the other hand, with required reading, and this is just my opinion, it does taint the experience because you are getting graded on it. You have to memorize certain points. Sometimes you have to perform speeches or write down, monologues, memorize all of these things. And that can take away from your enjoyment of something. And if it's taught, if it's taught to you well, it would just enhance your enjoyment of it. But, it is what it is. And so I think if we're talking about retellings and reimaginings of stories, then, and accessibility, then required reading is part of that, because so much of these stories are like deeply within our culture. I think Sydney's speeches in A Tale of Two Cities are well known, and people know them, and they might not know where they come from, right? It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. You might not know where that is from. That is from here. So it is so like deep within our culture that part of that, I think, is just because we are like forcing children to read all of this stuff. Just, I would like to know what you think about this, and also your exposure to A Tale of Two Cities.
Okay. This is I feel like this is all kind of layered, because I do agree with you. I think, we talk about challenging ourselves on the podcast, right? We've exposed ourselves to different genres that we might not have, and even different authors. Even like usually we pretty much lean predominantly towards female authors, and even having like other authors, we've been like, okay, we've learned, we've challenged ourselves. It may or may not be good for you. Starting the podcast is another perfect example. I had never, I apparently there was always the pipeline of fantasy, but I never thought to continue reading it as an adult. But yes, to the required reading, I think it's interesting because there's also not a uniform of what the required readings are across the board in school. I know, during one of our summer reading lists, we had a list of books that we can choose from, and we had to choose however many. I cannot recall if A Tale of Two Cities was on any of those lists, but I definitely didn't choose to read them at any point because I just didn't remember. I chose something else. I think I chose Huck Finn or something, and, Of Mice and Men at one point, and
Twain, Steinbeck.
Yeah, I know. And believe me, it took me so long because of the colloquial writing, right? Because that's one of the things, and you're like, you find yourself like, and I read that when I grew up in the South. So even reading it in the South, understanding it, I was just like, it just felt very jilted. So I think that's like a good example. So, but it's like but at the same time, you take the joy. So how many times has the conversation been where you were forced to read? People have lost their joy of reading following required education, and then higher education, because everything was meant to be consumed. You have to learn how to consume the media, test well for it, and then on to the next, because you need to focus on another class. You need to focus on passing. You need to focus on scholarships. You need to just keep moving forward. So there's no time to really enjoy any of the required reading. So yeah, it's kind of hard. And where I don't know if it's changed at all, where people will say, kind of like a show and tell, like a book report, pick any book. Maybe these are your key themes. Go to your library, speak with educators, speak with librarians, and maybe they can guide you. And then you just present the book. I feel like you would, and if they hit those themes, you kind of talk about it and you could still get the same message. And we do it all the time on the podcast. You can still pull a message out of something sometimes. Yeah, I just think it's so layered. And because, even before we started recording, we were talking about our own high school experiences of our required reading, the way our classes were formatted, and different classes and what senior year looked like, and AP, all the different types of degrees you can get with graduating. So I think, and we lived in the same state. So on top of that, we lived in the same state. We discussed our core curriculum and our exposure, which also just showed how different that it doesn't matter if you're in the same state. It doesn't matter. There is no uniformity for that. Like, oh, these are the classics. This is going to be required reading, but it isn't for everyone.
It isn't for everybody. And, I think I'm just going to generalize. Your like track in high school, also dictates like what you can choose from, as you said, Jess. Mm-hmm. And then also, what you choose to read. Also, I didn't appreciate Dracula or Frankenstein until I read the hell out of them in college for a monsters class that I had to take.
That's cool. That's a cool fucking class. And you can just kind of dissect it more.
Yeah, it was very cool. So and those are Dracula and Frankenstein are classics, and I had read them before in high school, so it was like a double exposure. So when we talk about classics, I think it's important to talk about A Tale of Two Cities is something that maybe you might not be familiar with, but if you've read The Infernal Devices,
Laura, you had to remind me.
by Cassie Clare, then you have read the love story more or less of A Tale of Two Cities, my gem. It's very similar. I mean, there's Lucie. What is their child's name? It's Lucie. Like, it's all really, what's their favorite book? You know, all this stuff. You know, Will, you're better than Sydney Carton. You live your life. You know, Sydney was this. There's this whole dialogue in The Infernal Devices about how Will Herondale sees himself as Sydney. That's why Clary finds the book. So A Tale of Two Cities, just in the ACOFAE world, does hold a very special place. It's just not one that we have dissected yet. So let's actually look at this, and then let's talk about some interpretations, reimaginings, and reinventions of some classic stories. Because ultimately, I think all of these versions of classic stories fall under the category of accessibility, because you might not like A Tale of Two Cities. You might love this book because this book has magic in it, has goblins in it, has fairies in it. It has a lot of stuff that you will love. The Goblin Market. We're back in a Goblin Market. Hot damn. So I think that is a huge thing. I think, Jess is going to talk to us about a little later. Yes, you are. Movie retellings and reimaginings of classic novels. It's all there. Looney Tunes has so much of this that if you're of a certain age, you were exposed to as a child and you don't even know it. It's just, it's always there. So when you're reading a classic and the story sounds familiar, you're like, oh, gee, this kind of sounds like it's because you're reading the original. And that is kind of cool. And I do think, here's my main point, and then we can really dive into this. It's 2025, and there are a lot of people doing a lot of things to make sure that a lot of literature is not to be read. So I think that while we preserve, protect, and really learn the literature that we love, we also champion the classics and make the fight about the classics while we protect everything else while they're busy with the classics, right? Because you can argue about A Tale of Two Cities. You can't ban A Tale of Two Cities. Tell me why you're going to ban A Tale of Two Cities. Are you out of your fucking mind? That's Charles Dickens. That's a classic. You can have that conversation while you silently collect all of the books that you need to save and protect before they're fucking banned.
2025 continues. Yeah.
Yeah. Or our Roomba becomes sentient and starts writing books through AI.
Which they already are.
So I think that is another thing. Lift up and preserve the classics before the robots take everything.
It'll be Pride, Prejudice, and Robots. Who needs zombies?
Again, yes, exactly. Exactly. And when we talk about accessibility, I mean, that's accessibility for all. So for all means that we can have a magic version of A Tale of Two Cities. Jess, what was it like reading a magic version of A Tale of Two Cities, having not been super familiar with the OG?
I was very confused at first. But that's because I don't read the classics. Like, that is not a testament to the book. That's not a testament to the author. That is a testament to me as the reader. That doesn't mean that this is a critique or saying that the book was bad. I was confused. And then as I kept reading it, I was like, okay, we have a male main character, which is also something that I'm not used to working with. And again, I don't want it to seem like the odds were against me because we had the fantasy element, right? And then at times, because we're finding out that Sydney, he has a childhood best friend, love of his life, knows that she dies. And we also find out that he was also stolen from the mortal realm and was living in Fairy. And at 13, you kind of get these choices. You either go back into the mortal realm or you stay in Fairy and kind of become a slave. But all in all, he also finds out that his best friend, love of his life, died and there's a changeling in her place. So I think when I was reading through this, at first I was like, is this a murder mystery? Is this a thriller? Now I'm trying to make the connections again because I hadn't read, and I still haven't read A Tale of Two Cities. I'm thinking of when we did our fantasy detective book back in January, The Wizard's Brew. I'm like, okay, let me get in this headspace because this is some sort of thriller. And then once our main character, Sydney, he meets his changeling who's falling in love and gets set up to marry the changeling of his love of his life. That's when I started to connect. Oh, wait, this is giving very much Jem and Will and Tessa because Sydney is still finding a way to be a part of their lives, just kind of like an Uncle Sydney kind of situation. And he's visiting, drops in, loves the kid. And even by the end of this book, you have his changeling, he's not really so certain that he's a changeling, but he knows it's something. There's a different layer because not everybody knows about fairy and changelings, but and even his, Lucie Manette, she's like, I'm having memories, but they feel like dreams. And there's this acknowledgement of some sort of there's always been a love there for each other. And that's when I was like, oh, that was when I was connecting all the infernal devices of it all. And then again, the plots, because then you have Sydney doing kind of shady deals, but for survival. So he's working with Shadow, he's working with Bartholomew, and it's always a means to the end because he's trying to ultimately fuck other people over who fucked him over and is the death of his best friend. So it was just really interesting and how the fantasy elements kind of wrapped themselves in. I felt like it was, if anything, more digestible than if you just said let's cover a classic for the pod. And I would have been like, do we have to?
That's exactly right. I think it's really important to note the digestibility of this. It is not just a straight classic, but it does follow all of the beats, and it has most of the same characters, and there's a lot of new additional fun characters, and it really shapes the story in a way where you're like, oh, okay, well, I guess if I pull out the fantasy element, I see the exact classic story. So that's really something. And also for people picking this up who might not be interested in the classic or might have read it a while ago, this could just be a fun refresher or something to really kind of jog your memory and be like, wow, okay, I really do remember that. And pass it off to somebody else who, again, might not be interested, but could really like zombies, could really like fairies, could really like vampires. There are a lot of books in this genre, which I think is really fun. Okay, let's talk about, since we're talking about this book in particular, let's talk about the fantasy elements of this. So in A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Darnay and Sydney looked very similar. And so that is explained here by they are each other's changeling. So Sydney was the original and Darnay is the one who was swapped. And in this book, changelings have blue eyes. And so when we follow all of the beats of A Tale of Two Cities in the courtroom, we're defending, we meet Lucie, all of this stuff in London, we are then weaving through the fairies, in particular Shadow, who turns out to be the primary handler, more or less, of Sydney, who is a mortal servant, and Bartholomew, who has her own plots, which is to open all of the fairy gates and overthrow the Summer King, because the Summer King has locked all of the fairy gates to keep fairy into fairy. All very interesting stuff. Important to point out that Bartholomew, to open all of the gates, needs the blood of a royal, a martyr, and a fairy by the winter solstice to open all of the fairy gates. But how do you get fairy blood? And that is kind of the driving force of the plot, even though we don't know it until way later. We don't know that until the end of the book, that is what is going on.
The last 80 pages. It is crazy because we received this as physical copies, but we also read it through audio. And at some point towards the end, I'm like, how much do I have left? And I was like, this is all happening in the last 3 chapters? Well, it felt that way.
Yeah, it's
that's where I was dog-earing. Because you have I don't want to say it was the evil villain monologue, but that kind of starts around 3 something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really something. Does this follow the pattern? Yes. By chapter 5, everything is more or less out there. But we have flashbacks of Sydney with his childhood love, Ivy, and how they were planning to escape the realm together. But they got up there and the land shifted, because that's what happens in Fairy, and Shadow could only catch one of them. And he chose Sydney because Sydney's family had wronged Shadow the most. And Ivy's family had wronged him less. So he needed Sydney to suffer more. So for the fantasy element of this, Sydney's suffering drives Shadow, because that is the point of all of this, is to watch Sydney suffer.
It's the whole sins of the father.
It's exactly it. It is the entire sins of the father, because of course Sydney, being a changeling / mortal servant, he doesn't know his family until Shadow makes them meet. And so Shadow facilitates all of this to get revenge. I mean, the whole fantasy element of this is a revenge plot on multiple different levels, 3 different levels. So very, very interesting stuff. I want to say that I read this 2.5 times, and the 0.5 times that I got through this, I was really getting all of the jokes and the witty, quickness of it. It just took me that many times because, 1, to learn what happens, 2, to take notes, and 3, to really understand it. And that's my 0.5 is my 3. So I was really haha. Ha 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 ha! That's quick and funny, Sydney.
But it's that British. It's the British humor, which it's interesting because again, it's in book form, right? But if this was on the television, I don't know. You can pick up on the dry wit of British humor differently on a TV than reading it sometimes. Yeah, because it is very funny, especially in the beginning. Sydney's he sees the fairy. He's what should I call you? And he's do you... my name is Shadow. He's I was going to call you Bartholomew. And then he meets another one. And she was you can call me whatever you want. He's all right, Bartholomew. And I was hey, you were so quick with that, sir. You're I like this name and I'm going to stick it on whoever lets me. And keep in mind, he's assigning the names because if you follow fairy lore, knowing a name, you hold a lot of control over that person or being.
Yeah, it's very fun. It's very witty. It's very fun. It was very enjoyable. We should mention Thorn, Addison Thorn. Addison Thorn is kind of the linchpin in this whole thing. Addison Thorn is like a stage magician, but he is so much more than that. Jess, do you know what he is?
I mean, I feel like this is where I was so confused because I was like, wait, he's fairy? No, he's half fairy because his mom was fairy, but his dad was human. But then his mom died during birth. It was such like a messy, I don't want to say messy. I feel bad. Honestly, I feel bad for Addison because he spent his whole life thinking one story and it turns out to be like, that's not any of what's going on. And he's kind of like, what was it? His mom died during childbirth and he didn't have a say. He was just a kid. He was a baby. He was a newborn and they took him to fairy, but raised him as a human. Did I misunderstand that?
Okay. So Thorn's mom was, all right, let's just talk about this whole thing. This whole thing. So Thorn's mom fell in love with someone in the mortal world. And she drank some wine and became mortal. Because you become mortal, a fairy becomes mortal by eating or drinking something prepared by human hands. So she became mortal.
Which is why he had the whole strawberry.
Yes. But then she was then taken by the Marquis and his brother and then like horribly sexually assaulted and abused. And then she became pregnant and had Addison. But with the way that it was, he is half fairy.
Because his mom was okay.
Yeah, and like all of so he's half fairy. So then he was taken by Shadow and put into the mortal world because that was Cloud, Shadow's first love. Just like Ivy was Sydney's first love. So Shadow's whole thing is to get revenge on this entire bloodline that screwed over his one true love, Cloud.
Which was Sydney's bloodline.
So then he switches out Sydney and Charles Darnay. So then he has control of Sydney as a mortal servant and makes him do things, ultimately then leading to Sydney deciding to take control back of his life and to have himself executed in place of Charles Darnay, who has been married to Lucie, who is the changeling of his love, Ivy. It sounds complicated. It is a little bit. The third read, though, slaps. I gotta tell you, it's
and
good.
Know, if you make your
funny.
own like family tree murder map, then all is dandy.
Yeah, and then you get it, and then it's very fun. I have to say, I do appreciate the character of Lucie in this book. I really kind of appreciate and really like her, especially when she says when Sydney is at the house, right? He's like, she's like, are you going to propose? He's like, I don't know. Am I going to propose? I don't know. and then he doesn't. And at the end, she's like, I would have said yes.
'Cause you know what? It was like, she's like, I understand the expectations of me being a single gal and the expectations my family have. And he was even realizing, oh shit, I realize and he realizes it too late. I realized me coming to approach her by myself, how this is going to look. And it's not that. And choosing Sydney would have been like her choice, something not chosen for her in this 1700s world. And it just like gutted him because he admits it because we have timelines throughout this story. And he even says like, oh, so I finally realized what Rosemary told me 13 years ago is even though I love Ivy, I also love Lucie separately, even though it's not just because like that's her changeling. I love Lucie for who Lucie is, not who she represents.
Oh, especially in the end, because this takes place during the French Revolution, in London and between London and Paris, and we take this ends in Paris. But especially at the end, when Darnay's been in prison, and Sydney is just walking around, and he sees Lucie. And he sees like all of the changelingness of her has basically been burned away by experience and grief. And she is pure Lucie. And it's like the Luciness just shined through, and there was nothing left of Ivy. And it was just like this like overwhelming beacon of like, yes, it is her. I do love her. And that, especially too, because the description is like, she's tired, and her eyes are sad. Her hair is limp. She's got lines on her mouth. Like the etherealness, the changelingness is gone, and all I see is the humanness. It was a very lovely description and a very lovely moment between them, because again, we have the classic story of like Sydney is just like a wherewithal, like, drunk, essentially, who is just getting by. He doesn't care about anybody or anything. But he becomes his best self in the presence of, or in the pursuit of protection of Lucie. And so it's like he makes himself the best that he can be for her, and by extension, her daughter and her family a little bit. But in the original, there's a little bit of a Jesus thing with the sacrifice, and because he drinks a lot of wine too. So there's less of that here, and there's more magic. So I appreciated that. I appreciated that. And the sacrifice at the end where Sydney and Charles switch places was less about Jesus to me, and much more about taking back your own self-control, making a decision for yourself, finally, locking eyes with your abuser and taking back your control.
The ownership of it. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. That's how I took that.
No, that's such a great interpretation, because I also feel like there's in the conversation of sense of ownership, it's having those conversations with each other. So Sydney with Charles and vice versa. And like, I don't know if ownership is the right word, maybe accountability and vulnerability, because, Charles is even saying, you know what? And so earlier in the book, Sydney is like, I have a feeling that Charles is a little bit, jealous of me because his wife is always asking about how I'm doing. His daughter is always more excited to see me because I'm the fun new person. I'm not the one she gets to see every day. And then at the end, you see a vulnerability that Charles shares with Sydney saying, I feel like I stepped in between something that you both had, you all had something, and I was just an outsider looking in. And I feel like I disrupted something that was there. That I think it's almost like seeing another version. And it's not like it is in the situation where you're seeing another version of yourself with a different POV.
Yeah. It's like if I had just made a few different choices, then that could have been my life kind of thing. Like you're looking in a mirror reflection situation, which is tough. I mean, that's tough. Also worth mentioning that there is just a wonderful through line that starts in the very beginning of the book and takes place at the very end, because it's how it happens, is the character of Barshan. He murders his changeling and then takes his place. And that ends up being the caretaker for Lucie. So it's all like very close connection. But in the beginning, Sydney's like, what am I going to do? Go kill him and take his place? And Shadow's like, I mean, like, don't do that. But like, yeah, we're all a little worried about it. And Sydney's like, that's crazy. Why would I do that? And then Barshan's like, it works though. It works if you want to evade the wild hunt for the rest of your fucking life, and only if you have realm silver, because hot damn, you've got to hide forever. What is the wild hunt, Jessica Marie?
We love the wild hunt. If you follow the podcast, you know how much we love shadow hunters. So the wild hunt, this is why I had a familiarity with the wild hunt, was because the wild hunt are the fae of fairy on a hunt of pursuit. Who they like, there's typically with the wild hunt, there is a motivation for them, running around searching for people to kind of prosecute and kind of hold fae up. They uphold the fae law, and we are taking down people, we are bringing people in, we are questioning them, because why are things going awry? Why? And then even at one point they're bringing in Sydney, the wild hunt, and the wild hunt is going, Sydney's able to lie against the fae. And that's a first, because what mortal has ever lied? Like, what does he have? And we know he has real silver. We also know he knows his own name. So having ownership and knowing your own name, those two kind of work in your favor if you are mortal. And at the same time, the wild hunt is out for a lot of people, and they start questioning, start questioning Sydney more and more, because why is this mortal all of a sudden showing up and being in places? Is he being told by other fae to be here, show up? And he starts lying a lot. These are the means to his end, because he is in pursuit of finding out, kind of getting justice for Ivy.
Well, and he's lying to the Summer King. We need to be so clear on that. Sydney's lying to the Summer King, which everyone is like, damn, boy, you got some balls to do that shit. And
they know he's lying too.
Yeah. And they know he's lying. And Shadow knows too. Fairy in this iteration is very fun, because Fairy's constantly changing, but the only thing that doesn't change is human bones brought back from the mortal world. And that's crazy. So the children that they take, the changelings, live in a village made of bones. And that is just such again, the beautiful nightmare that is Fairy in all its iterations. Like, that is such an image, right? My God, how amazing. And Sydney has to go back and forth to there to be questioned again and again, because Shadow and Bartholomew have like these moving plots, and Sydney spends some time in fairy prison, and that sucks, and he hates it very much. And it is torture for him to be there, but he bears it. Because he has this like burning sensation of like, I've got to protect Lucie. I have to protect her child, Lucie Ivy. Again, because Lucie has these echoes of this past life of Ivy. Just as you said, like, I see you there. I don't see my husband there. I see you. And that, this, what are we? What are we? And then Sydney says, like, it doesn't matter. Would it matter? Does it matter? No, it doesn't. Knife to heart. Yeah, for real. For them. Knife to heart. Important to say that the last dream of my soul speech is in here, as is, the best of times, worst of times, with little tweaks. So again, it follows all the beats, very fun, back and forth between Paris. We've got Roland. We've got everybody. But then we have Rosemary, who we haven't really mentioned much, but Rosemary and Thorn, which I think is very fun and should be something. Rosemary and Thorn. It just rolls off the tongue very well. Some sort of shop. But they are this little pair of revolutionaries. Again, we mentioned earlier that he is a stage magician. He's also the fairy that Bartholomew wants to use to open the gates, just as little poetic justice against Shadow, but that goes awry for her, which is very fun and very clever. I liked how that worked out. Very lovely. But Rosemary and Thorn want to go to Fairy to free all of the children. And through twists and turns and realm silver poisoning, Thorn is able to see at the end of the book the location of all of the changelings and mortal servants in the realm and in the world, and they're going to go find all of them and bring them to safety and free them from the clutches of fairy. Because just as you said, they are basically like slaves, more or less, to the whims of fairy, and nobody wants that because, again, fairies are scary.
Yeah, like traditional, like traditional fairies, because I feel like, again, this is fairies in the sense of where you're like, fairies are a hard sell, right? And I feel like the traditional fairy, because I'm still doing my rewatch of True Blood, and they're exposed. They're not like these ethereal. I was like, oh my God, I thought it was a goblin, and that was not the case, because they are fairy in the way that it's like FAERIE fairy. I don't know. That scares me.
Yeah,
because every time when we think of Holly Black or Shadow, like I'm still like, give me some fairy wine, and you're like, no. I feel like these are the fairy that people are like, don't go in the mushroom circle. Do not go in the wild mushroom circle. Don't go through the arch of the tree. Those are the fairies that I might be exposed to, not our 500-year-old males.
You listen to the music and you will dance until your feet fall off. All of this stuff, all of the scary fairies. Okay, good stuff. So good stuff here. This was a very fun, interesting read. Okay, we're talking about accessibility. Jessica Marie, talk to us about what you have found when you have found things about retellings, reimaginings, and reiterations.
Well, I feel like I found we were going through lists, right? And how do things get equated? Or like we were talking about, and you had brought up before we recorded earlier in this episode about A Tale of Two Cities and your exposure. When was the first exposure? I go, I've never read this. And you go, no, you have. You've read The Infernal Devices. This is that same story. And I feel like you can also, we spoke with the author of The Scandalous Confessions of Lydia Bennet Witch by Melinda Taub. And I remember we were familiar with the story. We knew Pride and Prejudice. So I thought that was a good example of being familiar with the story. And now here you have a retelling with a fantasy element and with a different point of view, because now we're following Lydia Bennet, and you have Lizzie, who we know her story, and her timeline is going in and out of that. And so having that background made Pride and Prejudice that much more fun, because we're like, oh, this is a different retelling. And then you have other ones, which we recently covered, Cinderella is Dead by Kaylin Bayron. And even though it's not a retelling, I think we described it more as an extension of a familiar story and one variation of the story that is given to the public. But then we found out more about the extension of that story behind closed doors. And I think when you make these stories accessible and palatable, it makes you want to maybe go back, maybe learn a little bit more. Because we also talk about this in our Romeo and Juliet episode for Baz Luhrmann. And I know that there is a media version, you have the play, and everybody knows sometimes William Shakespeare, unless you have until you get the flow, it can be a little bit difficult to read. And then there was a movie, the 1970s version, and that's just boring in my opinion. But then Baz Luhrmann comes and he uses William Shakespeare exact dialogue like William, and makes that a 90s version with Claire Danes and Leo DiCaprio. And all of a sudden you are just immersed in it. And how many more iterations can you find? And I think that's always the fun thing about reading and media in general and consuming it, how to make it palatable so you want to have fun and learn and engage with those stories.
I'm thinking about the rise of AI and
how that's gonna contribute
exactly, and how that is going to contribute, because the attention spans are getting shorter and the books aren't getting shorter.
They
Honestly,
are not.
books are getting longer. And that's an issue. It's an issue. And classics, just as you pointed out, especially like colloquial classics like Twain, are difficult to read for a lot of people. So again, with the accessibility, so I am afraid, honestly, of losing the ancient texts and having everything being reduced to an AI summary on Google. That freaks me out a bit, honestly. But I do know that there are a lot of movies that have this retelling, reimagining aspect. Isn't that right?
Yeah. I mean, we've covered 10 Things I Hate About You on the podcast, and that's a version of Taming of the Shrew. Again, William Shakespeare. You also have The Lion King, which is Hamlet. Clueless is a loose retelling of Emma by Jane Austen. And I know you and I have experienced this because we're talking about movies, but, take media a step further and you have immersive theater. You and I went to the interactive Sleep No More in New York. It actually just closed January 2025. But that is an immersive experience of a retelling of Macbeth. And you still need to understand. That's one where I don't feel like you can go to without a lot of context. You could have fun, but because there are so many different storylines that you have to follow, and you can only follow one storyline at one time, if you don't know the story, you don't necessarily know the whole picture of what's going on. Because when you were with the witches orgy, you were with the witches. I was with somebody else following, somebody was taking a bath in a couple, and editor Sam was at an orgy. So we were all at very different points in Macbeth until we go to the Great Hall for
murder.
That's where we're finding things out.
Murder.
So I don't know. I think, what's your take? Because, a lot of retellings, both media and books. And now you're talking about AI too, which is also crazy because if you Google, sometimes you're like, I don't need AI. I'll just Google it myself. And that's still the first option they give you.
Yeah. Where do I stand? Okay. I think that this genre is so much fun. I think it's a way to get people into the classics. I think it's a way to promote reading. I think it's a way to promote accessibility. I think it's a way to make it fun. I do think that if it's not revisited again, then you're not going to really understand the classic part of the story. But again, a lot of our classics are deeply embedded into our cultural zeitgeist. Again, I'm going to point you to Looney Tunes. So that's a part of it too. But I've got a list here of just fun books that are kind of in the same genre. So Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, that's the big one. That was a movie, right? The prequel, Dawn of the Dreadfuls, you've got Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, right? Super fun. Android Karenina, that's wonderful, right? We love it. And then there's other ones. I've got modern ones over here. James, which is Huck Finn. We have, what's the one? Oh yes, this one. Boy Snow Bird. This one looks wonderful. This is a retelling of Snow White. Amazing. Aisha at Last. This is a Muslim retelling of Pride and Prejudice. Amazing. March. This is about Mr. March and Little Women. There's also, I believe there's one of Little Women and Werewolves. That's very fun. What's another one that we have here?
So you found a lot of examples of retelling classics with the fantasy element.
With the fantasy element, and again, just kind of maybe just diverse reads, because you need to read diverse authors all year. We absolutely promote that here at ACOFAE. There's another one going bovine, which is Don Quixote. There's just a lot. There's a lot of retellings. There's a lot of modern retellings that don't have any fantasy in it. But again, accessibility. And it is important that we keep our ancient texts in the time of AI. I cannot stress enough how much AI freaks me the hell out. It's just this tool that makes me think every time you use it, your brain just kind of like shrinks a little bit because you're not using any sort of critical thinking skills.
But that's been proven. You and I have had a conversation in the morning that has been statistically proven that you're not. I mean, there are people out there who can't write and formulate emails without going through AI first to go, well, how have you been writing emails this whole time? Why don't we just keep doing that? I don't know. It definitely makes me sound like antiquated and old, and they don't make them. Like, I know that probably sounds like they age me, but Laura, I know you have your master's. I'm scared to go back to get my master's knowing the conversations that are happening where there are professors out there who will say, we think that you're writing, you didn't write this. You had AI write this because you know how to use an M dash and an Oxford comma. Like, that is actual conversation that is happening.
God forbid.
While the professor is using AI to read your stuff.
Yeah. It's just changing the landscape, and I don't love it. And it again, protect the ancient texts, protect the classics. Use the classics to fight the good fight while you protect all of the wonderful, like, diverse queer literature that they're trying to take away from us. But again, accessibility. You don't want to read the classics, but you read about sea monsters, right? We love that. And then, stick that, get it from your library and listen to it through audio, true accessibility. That's amazing. Things like that. Because when you are forced to read something, it can taint the experience. But when you get to choose the way that you, approach it and choose something that is more palatable, just as you said, more digestible, then you are getting the basics of this story with a little bit of the element that you are looking for. Because, I mean, there's also like sci-fi retellings of this stuff. Let's not forget the Lunar Chronicles and Cinder, which is a retelling of Cinderella. And then Scarlet, which is Red Riding Hood. Cress, which is Rapunzel, Scarlet, which is Snow White, and there's one more I can't think of. But yeah, so that is also something as well.
That's so exciting. You have a lot of really good examples. I know you're on top of it as always. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Hey, I do what I can for our listeners.
But with that being said, feel free to follow us on Instagram. We're at ACOFAE Podcast. We're also both on TikTok, ACOFAE Laura and ACOFAE Jessica. We're on YouTube now. Also, feel free to give us 5-star ratings on whatever listening platforms you follow us on. We so appreciate it. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.
Bye.